Hi, and welcome to another Pi Crowdcast. I'm Rick Teresi, the co-founder and general manager of Pi. And today our guest is Leah Noble Davidson. Hello, Leah.
Hello.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for spending time with us. Glad your internet came back up so that you could spend time with us. If you haven't been to Crowdcast before or haven't participated in one of these, there are a few logistics to take care of. So there's chat over there that you can be talking with one another or talking to me. I will go ahead and monitor that as we're going through the event. And if I keep doing this, it's because my laptop is down there and you're right there, so I'm not ignoring you. I'm just looking at what's going on down there. If you have a question for Leah, the best way to get that in the queue is to use the ask a question button, which is right down at the bottom of your screen. And even if you don't have a question, pop in there, see what questions have been asked, and then you have the opportunity to upvote questions that you think you would like to hear the answer to. So we can kind of keep the whole thing focused on stuff that's most important to people in attendance. Okay? Any questions, any technical difficulties? If you're getting an echo or you can't hear, just pop that in chat and I will make sure and hopefully help you resolve that as quickly as possible. So without further ado, Leah, welcome. Can you please just kind of give us your background and some context for the conversation today?
Sure, absolutely. So let's see. When I was one of those little kids that asked questions all the time. And I feel like I got really lucky because I got the opportunity to turn that into something people will pay me for. I think I had always been really inquisitive, and I was much more of a writer, and I have a background in poetry and do a lot of experimental poetry. And I started dating this computer guy in the early 2000s. And I was very much not a computer person, but he was a vegetarian, and I was learning how to make vegetarian food. And so I was like, well, you're a computer guy. Can't you just magic me, an app? And I didn't even know the word app then. It was magic, right? That will take all the recipes that I've been collecting and I can put them into the magic computer box, and then it will spit me out a grocery list so I don't have to add like 3 tomatoes and 2 of these for all these different recipes. And he, a total smarty pants computer guy, said, do you want it to print out by aisle? And I was just like, whoa. So he was like, well, you have to make the GUI. And I was like, what's a GUI?
Lingo.
Right. So after that, I got into learning how to make interfaces, and we did a couple of really interesting startup things back when Y Combinator was around. Yep. And I mean, I'm sure it still is, and I'm sorry if it isn't. I just made it that way, but it was like such a big thing.
It's got some changes, but it's still around. Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, that was rude. So over time, I ended up learning about this guy, Jan Chipchase, and it turns out he was a design researcher. And there was an article in Fast Company, and it said, there's a guy that travels around the world and asks people to dump out their bags. And then, what do you have in your bag? And I was like, oh my gosh, that's totally my dream job. I love talking to people and asking them about stuff. So I got a design research degree, started working with a bunch of tech communities. And even though it was fun to work on these really big projects, I am a very scrappy person. And so I felt like I ended up working better with other scrappier teams, where you don't have as much of the paperwork in between things, but you have a real need to be like, how do we stretch something that doesn't go far enough? What do we do if we don't have a budget? How do we get a hold of people? And that sort of like community thing really, like, it warms my heart and I love it. And it's just really fun to see directly the people that you're helping and to be able to help them get somewhere and to really feel like you're being useful and not just filling off a box. Yeah. So I just fell in love with the startup community, and it's taken me a little while to figure out how to continue to stay afloat, making a living as a consultant for startups. But I've been lucky enough to work with Jive and Puppet Labs and Torch and lots of other smaller ones that I don't list off as much, but just a bunch of really amazing super geniuses. And you're like, I'll just go talk to people and come back. And
That's awesome. What was the name of the guy who had people dump their bags out? People didn't quite catch that.
oh, his name's Jan Chipchase. It's Jan. And he has a company now called Studio Radio Durin.
Okay.
Just look up Jan Chipchase. He's the reason why you have a camera in your phone. So, yeah, a long time ago, he was working
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was working for Nokia, and he was like, "Dude, you guys are making phones. One day, people are going to want cameras." And that took like 10 years for him to be right, but he was.
That's crazy. How are you? Obviously, you like people. You like your Nats, and just it's a good time for a product plug for the Reverend Nat's Hard Cider. Thank you, Reverend Nat, for supporting the show and our guests. We really appreciate it. And if you're in the Portland area, unfortunately, if you're in above the state line in Vancouver, he can deliver over there. But if you're in Portland, he has cider by delivery. So please hit him up and grab some of that. How have you been holding up, Leah? Like, I mean, during this situation in particular?
Well, I was lucky enough before February started to have a variety of different projects, and we were doing just fine. And then COVID kind of slowly sort of chopped everybody that I was helping off at the ankles. And since I helped them, then all of our projects sort of stopped. One of the cool things about that, which is part of why I offered, see, this whole thing, I was supposed to be asking you questions.
You can ask me questions later. I'm going to ask you questions now.
So this, I had been toying with, what if I started like a tech startup and wasn't just being an entrepreneur that was helping people, because I love talking to people so much. I was like, what if I made an app where geeks could talk to each other? And because we've got such specialized language, and people seem to feel a lot more connected. The younger we get, those generations feel a lot more connected to people they see online than the people they know face.
Yep.
But because I was busy and I was helping these other communities, it was always on the back burner. Since all of my stuff was on pause, luckily it's on pause, it gave me time to start learning more about the building of this thing. And right as soon as that started to get a little bit of traction, and I was experimenting on all of my friends and family to use this crazy app thing that I made, I ended up being in the MIT COVID-19 challenge, which is pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
And came up with an idea.
Maybe talk a little bit about that for people who aren't familiar with that challenge.
Sure. Okay, so the COVID-19 challenge, they're going to have another one in May. I don't know what the day is. Okay. I'm sorry, they didn't send it. But when it comes out, I'll post on it for LinkedIn. So MIT had an event where at first it was invite only, and they had all these people come together, but they got way too many people, so they had to narrow it. It was solely for the purpose of getting a bunch of nerdy people together to try to solve some of the top problems that they're seeing as a result of COVID-19. So they brought in all these experts and all these people that are being affected by COVID-19, like specifically like really big people, because if you're MIT, you can do that, right? So
people have heard of MIT, I guess. Yes.
Yeah. So honestly, I joined it because, like, seriously, I don't have a job anymore, and I just get to do fun things and donate my time right now. And I was like, this is a wonderful reason to keep me from drinking all weekend. I was like, I don't know that I'll be able to help anybody, but at least I'll get to work on something and meet some cool people, right? And then I ended up getting together with a whole bunch of people that I didn't know. A whole bunch meaning four people that I didn't know from around the world. And we worked on this thing, and we were one of the winners, which is nuts, right?
Yeah.
So then MIT was like, okay, so we'll give you resources. And we got to talk to the AWS team last weekend, like a bunch of people, and they started handing us resources. And so we're working on it. And then in May, we get to pitch again, which is really cool, which was totally opposite world of what I was expecting, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, but I mean, you are, so little context for this question. I started my career as a literary agent, and you have a published book of poetry. Two published books of poetry. And so getting published, is incredibly difficult. Getting poetry published is exceedingly difficult. And so that's a very entrepreneurial experience. Maybe could you share a little bit about like what that journey was like for you and how that kind of informs like this kind of entrepreneurial drive you have now?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, well, okay. So in 99% of the things that I do, I never end up doing what I think I'm going to be doing. The MIT thing, case in point, right?
Right.
So same thing with poetry. I hear so many amazing, super talented poets talk about all the times they sent out letters and all of the rejections that they have to deal with. That wasn't my story. I was way more interested in helping people write poetry, kind of like with the Because Human stuff, right? Yep. Way more interested in that than I was in getting my own poetry published. So I was the Portland community coordinator for poetry, and I brought spoken word poetry into public schools. And then I had traveling poets come in, and we had a weekly workshop where like 12 to 20 people would show up. And after a couple of years of running this writing workshop, they were like, well, now we've got work and we want to know how to get it published. Right? So I was like, okay. So I called publisher. That's really cool. University of Hell in Portland. They totally like, scrappy poets. And so I'm like, hey, Craig, could you come in and talk to everybody about how to get stuff published? And he's like, absolutely. I'll bring some of my other editors. This will be great. So he shows up, and much like the internet today, like people didn't show up right away. Right? So
sure. Yeah.
I'm sitting there for like 10 minutes and I'm like, I am so sorry. There's like literally people here. And I feel so awful. And he's like, no, it's totally fine. Hey, do you have any poetry? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I think I like wrote a book, but like, yeah, sure. So I give him some poetry and he's looking at that. And then eventually people show up. It turns out nobody thought about printing anything because they normally wrote it when they were there. So everybody shows up. It's great. We have the workshop. It's totally fine. And then a week later, he shows up, and I'm like, what's going on? And he said, I'd really like to publish your book. And I was like, well, what? And he was like, I loved it. I would like to publish the book, and I think that it would do well. And I was like, what do I need to do? Like, this is weird. This is crazy. And I ended up having to be convinced by all my friends that it was something that I needed to pursue fully, because I was already working as a strategist, and they were like, you got to go on tour. And I was like, I can't go on tour. I have a job. And then I got handed, I think that's the thing. So when you're going to draw the parallels, I think being a part of the community is really important. I think that's something that you show as a mentor all the time. And then also putting people around you that will force you to respect the work that you do is something I know that I need.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody needs that, but I constantly need somebody to tell me I'm full of shit. And they're like, no, Leah, you can do this.
Yep.
Because I'm always like, oh, no. Yeah.
Well, and there's so much imposter syndrome in any creative industry. Like, I always think of startups as a creative pursuit, right? And people are full of self-doubt. And at the same time, the friction is that they have to pretend they're not, and that they think they're the right person to do this, and yet internally they're constantly arguing with themselves about like, I don't deserve this, am I the right person to do this? So it's very interesting coming from my background in literature into tech, which I believe engineering is a creative pursuit. I believe building businesses is a creative pursuit, but everybody wrestles with that kind of internal voice. And I think the thing that's interesting about your story is it really reflects to your point, being part of the community and being kind of those connected in a way that's valuable, but also that it's so much of it just comes down to timing. Like that's
Yeah,
really all it's about.
Oh, and then
Yeah.
the part that like I should plug, like, even if there's anybody out there that's the poetry community is fantastic. And honestly, just because I had for 2 years, I'd had traveling poets come through, and I just personally loved doing it. So I loved having them at my house and showing them around and making them dinner and all sorts of stuff. When I finally decided, okay, I'll go on tour, I thought I was going to do like a 1 day, like 1 week tour maybe, and I posted online. And unbeknownst to me, all of those people that I had at my house were like, now you have a show in the city. So in 72 hours, I booked 80 shows. And
That's crazy.
I was so overwhelmed because it wasn't me. And it wasn't even necessarily like any of the work that I did, right? It was just doing what you love, and like it comes. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It totally does. And I think that's a message people need to hear right now, right? Like, I mean, so many of us are struggling with this balance of like productivity versus like trying to figure out other ways to stay engaged while we're isolated and kind of self-quarantined. So, I mean, I think encouraging people to kind of pursue that creative stuff and lean into it is a message people need to hear right now, for sure.
Yeah.
I know you want to ask me questions. I'm totally fine with that. The folks in attendance have questions too. So why don't we jump to a few of those, and then as we get through those, then we can kind of turn the tables. And I think the best way for people to have an understanding of the work you do is just to kind of see the way you work. And so you can turn it back on me, and I'll answer questions and bore the audience to death with those responses. So, all right. So the first one we have for you is, how can people become better listeners? And who are some of the best listeners that you know?
Oh, what a great question. So, okay. I end up in modes I think when you're listening in an interview, it is different than listening in a conversation. Because when you're interviewing someone for, whether it's for research or anything, you end up doing 10% of the talking, right? And the other person does a lot more of the talking. And that's not the same with a normal conversation, right? There's a lot of sharing and identifying and agreeing with the other person. And those things are valid and wonderful and absolutely human. The same thing that makes people really good at conversations, though, doesn't necessarily make them really good at interviewing. And so I find myself often, as someone who talks a lot, trying to have some tricks, right? So one of the things that I'll do is while I'm listening to someone, I will push my toe down into the ground because it keeps me from jumping in, because there's so many things that I want to be like, oh yeah, oh, and then what else? Because I'm very enthusiastic. So I end up also, I always have a piece of paper. I do not take vigorous notes while I'm listening. I'm looking at someone, and I just always bring a recording device. You don't have to write everything down. It's way better if you're looking at someone when you're talking to them, because there's all these physical cues, there's social cues, there's all these things, and you miss those if you're trying to take too many notes. The only notes that I take are one-word notes about something I want to come back to. And that really helps me stay focused on listening, because a lot of the reason why we jump in is because we're afraid we're going to forget it, right? We're like, oh, I want to know this, right? And so you jump in thinking the other person can always come back to that. But then the conversation has veered, and now you don't remember where they were. So a cool pointer for also being able to make it so that you can interrupt someone when you're interviewing someone is start out with, after you get the background, who are you, where are you from, everything, what's going on, start out with a question where you ask them to tell you a story. And the story should be like, the parameters can be really long, and that's okay. Because then when you interrupt, you're already going along the story and people remember the story they were telling. So if you say, tell me the story of how you of your day. And it's only applicable if you're trying to talk about what you're interviewing about, right? But if I were to say, tell me the story of your day and then it's important, from the moment you wake up to, give them a from and a to. And people, it's really easy to get them rolling. And then they're like, oh, and then I do this and I don't do that. And if they're not specific enough, you can ask them more. And so the listening helps then too, because it makes you feel like you're solving a puzzle and you're just like in the movie, like, when are they going to say the thing?
It's so interesting you say that, because I think of so much of the work that I do with like connecting people who might not understand why they need to be connected. I always relate that to plot development. That it's like, these are two characters that need to meet in Act 3. So we're going to make those connections right now. They don't know why they're talking to one another, but I do, because I know what's going to happen. Yeah.
Interviewing people is reverse storytelling. You're trying to give them the beats that they need to know, but you don't know what the thing is. You just know that the beat should be there. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And
that's
so
awesome.
Yeah. Wait, listeners that I know that are really good.
Yes.
I don't know. They're all personal people that I know. I think that guy on Hot Ones does a really great job.
If people don't know Hot Ones, it's this interview show where people eat like wings while they're being interviewed by the guy. It's really entertaining.
That being said, too, the last thing before you jump in and ask me, the best question really is silence, which is so funny when you're talking about listening. There's sort of a way you can do it's almost like story listening, right? Where you kind of wait, and if someone sounds like they're just about to get to that plot line, and you don't know what to do, don't jump in. That's when you do the toe thing and you push your feet on the ground and you count. Like 1, 1,000, 2, count to 5 and do it real slow. And they'll usually just start talking again, just like I just did.
Interesting. All right. That's awesome. Thank you. I'll have to go back and rewatch this so I can actually understand how to interview people at some point in time. The next question. Oh, this is a good one. This is business oriented. Tell us the origin story behind the name Because Human.
I get really freaked out about the concept of naming things. And I had the pleasure of naming some other places and some other businesses. And I feel like it's more important than it probably is. It's more important to me than it probably is. But I went round and round and round and round. And then I read books on naming. And I got to this spot where if I'm talking about a human experience, I think maybe some of the poetry came in, and it was like the whole reason that any of this is important. How do I put that into the name? Like, this is why this is important, and just boiling it down, Because Human popped up as one of the options. So I had 5 options. Oh, this is good research stuff. I had 5 options that I wanted to do. I gave them a typeface treatment and like colors and everything, but I gave them all the same colors and all the same typeface treatment. And then I made a list of the people that I would want to work with, that I already knew, and some people that I didn't know, but the people who would be the exact people I'd want to work with. And then I emailed them and I sent them text messages of those. And I said, let's say you have a company that helps you do this, which was our mission statement. Which of these companies do you hire? And then I just waited and counted the tally out. And Because Human just killed it for everybody else.
Yeah.
I could have been Curious Frank, but I wasn't. So
Curious Frank is good too, by the way.
We were going to have a llama. It was going to be great.
You can still have a llama. Well, it could work. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been in marketing, clearly. Another question from folks is, what questions should we be asking?
Well, see, now I got to ask under what context, right?
Just generally, what questions should we be? Yeah.
Well, I think so I teach a lot of workshops on this, and then I also teach at PSU in the design thinking department. And so when we talk about just even beginners sort of asking a question, I think one of the things that I hear instead of what I would think should be being asked, if I could turn it into that, is sometimes you have a list of assumptions that you think are there, and then when you're out to explore what somebody else's experience is like, and I need to be really clear, the kinds of interviews that I do are someone hires because human when they're like, something's going wrong, but we don't know what, or we need to make something really cool, but we don't know what. You know, it's always like one of those things, or we're doing the best we can, but we don't know where we could help. So you notice that a lot of that is we don't know. When you're doing survey questions and stuff, that's about testing whether you're right or wrong, right? You have assumptions and you test them. So the kind of work I do is going out into the unknown. And I think that sometimes people will start with a list of questions where they're like, can I validate my assumptions? And the kinds of questions that I think should be being asked consistently sound like the dumbest ones, where you don't actually include a lot of information. And if you do know information, you don't even necessarily include it, because you end up finding like stuff you never would have thought of before. And your job as someone who's listening to someone isn't to validate that you knew you were right. Your job is to find stuff you never even knew, and that makes your job more fun. So I think the questions should be like, sometimes tell me more is the best question.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I think so often in these situations, people are doing so much prep and wanting to feel like they're knowledgeable before they talk to somebody that, if I'm hearing you right, they kind of over-architect their questions rather than just being more simple and basic about the pursuit.
Yeah, well, and you can really learn a lot more about someone by keeping the language really low and down and approachable, right? I probably say like the same 10 questions with like minor changes in most of the interviews that I do. Now there's an extra several sets of questions that are a little bit different, but honestly, it's, can you show me how? You know, show me how you do this. What do you mean? What's the difference? You know, and those are the kinds of words that I'm saying. So you'll notice that, like, you could say, what's the difference, whether you're talking to a video telematics company, which I have worked with, right? Or someone who does configuration management or artificial intelligence or augmented reality or makes bunnies. I don't know, makes like wind up bunnies, or, you know, anybody, because you're like, what's the difference between what happened then and what happens now? Ultimately, everybody's a storyteller. If you have something to say and it happened over time, it's a story. So you're sort of soliciting, you just kind of want somebody to show you the environment. And so you can be dumb, it's okay, because it's not really dumb to be dumb. It's kind of smart to be dumb.
I totally get that. Another question from folks. When interviewing, how do you identify gaps or opportunities that are going unsaid? Curious how to identify opportunities for new products or services from an interview. So maybe to put it in a slightly different context, you know, there's that battle between the customer is always right and the customer doesn't know what they want. And that seems to be where this question is kind of honing in on.
Yeah. No, okay. This is wonderful because okay, so there are a couple of things. If you're in a series of conversations and you keep hearing people say something usually happens, dig in more, because they wouldn't say something usually happens if there wasn't something else. They would just say, this is what happens. But if they're like, this is what usually happens, they can usually tell you something else, right? One of the other things you can do when you're thinking about who to interview, because there's a gazillion people that you end up needing to interview just to understand an ecosystem. But there's kind of a good general rule of thumb. So you want to interview people who are novices in a system, right? That might be using it. You want to interview people who are intermediates, and you want to interview experts, right? So I hear a lot about the the first one and the third one, like interview subject matter experts, and then have people run through it and they don't know it. But if you can interview people that, even if it's for a parallel system, right? Find how something works and interview somebody about that. The people who are intermediates remember what it was like not to know how to use it. And they've gone through this way of learning how to game the system. Like if something doesn't work, they know how to get around it because they've spent time with it. But the experts don't always know how to game a system or what to do because they've been using it too long that they've forgotten their words for it. So it's just normal body language, right? So if you want to find gaps, it's not just enough to talk to new users and experts. You have to talk to people who are figuring something out. Those are the people who will hand you the solutions a lot of times and details about the problems, because they're like, and then I tried that, and then duct tape.
Right. Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Is there ever a place for getting an answer, even if you don't know it's right, rather than asking a question? And let me know if you need me to repeat that.
I think that was Scott's question.
It is Scott's question. Yeah.
If somebody asks where the bathroom is, that is definitely time to ask them, to answer them, and not to ask a question.
Perfect.
I feel like if somebody's struggling a lot, they're struggling really hard because there are different kinds of interviews you can do. You can test a system, or you can go do exploratory research. If you're testing a system, meaning essentially you're just showing something that you made to somebody else, it's good to let them struggle for a little while. If not, just because it's a really great presentation when you come back to the client. If you jump in every time somebody has a problem, it's a difference between saying, how long do you think it should take to get through your onboarding experience, and letting everybody argue about it should be a minute or 2 minutes. And then the next slide is, well, on average, it takes someone 20 minutes to get through your onboarding experience. It has a lot less impact if you helped everybody 3 minutes later.
Right. Right.
But if someone's
Go ahead.
Oh, I said if someone's going to cry, though, help them. Like,
Right.
don't ruin the interview if they get upset.
Crying is a clear sign you shouldn't be asking questions. Got it. Okay. And last question, and then we'll let you turn the tables on me and really show people how it's done. How do you encourage coworkers who have great ideas but are generally timid and scared of being wrong? And this actually comes from Nat, who's talking about it from being in a privileged power position of being the white guy boss. How does he encourage more of that kind of conversation and questioning?
Now, I don't know if you did that, but that was almost like an alley-oop for me, because that is often the reason why people hire someone like me. For as much as you can have great intentions and you can be the kindest person ever, and sincerely in my own company, I have to get help because I experience the same thing, because it's not just about the skills that you have. It has to do with your roles and your responsibilities. And those are normal things that people have. Being able to provide anonymous spaces are really good. I've only been able to do it once, but you can actually make a suggestion box work. Often, though, you need prompts every week, and then everybody can drop them in. Don't just let it be a random box. So, I mean, that's a thing. You can put one question that you care about every week on a box, and then put really annoyingly colored sheets of paper on everybody's desk. with the question on the paper, and then it's like sitting there yelling at them, which is really hard because we don't work in spaces anymore. We're all virtual, but I don't know. Those kinds of things though kind of help. Repositories where you can collect and see patterns instead. They help people feel a lot safer. I think often though, if you want to solicit long stories, that's where someone like me comes in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's always a case for that kind of intermediary that can provide that privilege or power to someone to have their views conveyed at a higher level. So sometimes it's really hard to express your opinions to people in positions of power. So I think the work you're doing is critical in that regard, especially in a claiming to be a meritocracy kind of world like tech, when it actually isn't a meritocracy at all. So I really appreciate the work that you do. Okay, we made it through the questions. Now you get to ask me questions for a while.
Okay. So I got to figure out. Okay. So, I got to tell you something. So there is a major difference between interviewing someone where you get 1 hour to yourself to solve a puzzle about what it is that they need, and interviewing someone in this kind of a setting. And super kudos to you, Rick, because you're killing it and you're doing a great job. And
thanks. I appreciate it.
this is a whole new foray for me because I was like, what? But I really thought this was going to be like, I'm totally learning how to do this stuff with this MIT thing, and I want to pelt you with a gazillion questions. Okay, so I have an ad hoc works like prototype that's been used and iterated on, right? It's got wireframe concepts, but it's totally cobbled together, and it is definitely not an app, okay? I'm in need of someone with a technical background, and the devs that I've talked to are constantly asked for help. And so they're like, oh, I'd be excited to help, but like, tell me when you've got money. And then I hear on the other side that people who want to invest in things are often, they want you to have a paying customer, right? So how do you suggest navigating this kind of space?
So, 6 weeks ago, this would have been a very different response. In the previous normal, it really came down to the story you were telling about your product. It really had, sometimes it had to do with your technology stack. Like if you were working on something super compelling or doing something innovative with machine learning or artificial intelligence or voice driven kind of stuff, that might have been enough to kind of attract a developer, that kind of curiosity aspect to it. Now I'm not so sure. Like I've been through this a couple times before, and when there's a lot of talent on the street due to economic downturn, layoffs, those kind of things, you find people more willing to engage in projects just to have something to do. And so you're going to shift from this world of I'm a non-technical co-founder, I have no idea how to find a technical co-founder, to the polar opposite of I have no idea how to judge who the right technical co-founder is. I now have a bunch of technical people who are interested in participating in my project, but I don't know how to discern, given I don't have the technical acumen, I don't know how to discern who the right person is. And so that comes down to really it becomes a personality fit for people. Like this is a long-term relationship you're engaging in. It's a overused kind of phrase, but hire slow, fire fast kind of stuff. Like spend the time doing the research and asking the questions and having the hard conversations right now when there's not a lot of there. But it's never easy. It's never kind of a slam dunk. It's always just kind of an ongoing process for folks.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So the community is full of so many talented people that it can be super intimidating. So what are some examples of new teams who've successfully navigated the competitive side and the community side of startup world?
So the teams who do the best at navigating the community side in particular are the ones who are out and about. So there are kind of two ways of approaching community engagement from a business perspective. And one of those is, here we are, we're throwing events, everybody come to us to experience us in our community. And the challenge with that is you're basically in an echo chamber, right? You're not getting a full picture of the community. You're only getting a picture of the people who have kind of gravitated to you originally. So you very quickly run into kind of a constraint of a glass ceiling where you're not getting outside of your existing network. So I think the people who do the best are the ones who kind of, swallow their ego, embrace humility, and kind of empathy, and just engage with a variety of communities, whether they're important to them or not. And take the time to kind of be present and experience the kind of serendipity that comes from being present and involved with things that are tangential to what you do. And that's the way to get ahead of it. On the competitive front, I think the companies I find who are most successful don't see their competition as a negative. They very much take it from an objective viewpoint, like back to your earlier question of like, usually it does this, or why did we do it this way? Like, the market is big enough, the world is big enough that you can build a very successful company in a very competitive space if you come up with that unique proposition that speaks to a particular segment of the target market. And the value of your competition is helping you identify where those gaps exist. And kind of the overlay, the Venn diagram is, where do those gaps exist versus what are we passionate about and what do we want to build, and looking for those kind of opportunities. But in order to do that, you have to be intimately familiar with your competition and also somewhat collegial with your competition, because they will also recognize that they're delivering a different solution than you. And so in a perfect world, it's not a zero-sum game. Everybody coexists peacefully and has their own definitive markets.
That was so well said. Okay.
I just talking out my ass. I don't know what's going on. You just ask good questions and then I respond. That's how it works. And thanks to Matt's hard cider for the inspiration for those responses.
Okay, so you've talked about Pi exposing teams to the reality of the startup world as quickly as possible. Okay. Yep. So what are the three hardest reality checks that founders seem to experience the most often?
Ooh, okay. I'll see if I can limit it to three. So the first reality check is, and a lot of this is based on just mythology from the industry, but the first reality check is, in this day and age, good marketing trumps good functionality, or even great functionality. There was a space and time where you could build something that had some like technical functionality to it that was compelling, and maybe it was hard to use, or people didn't quite understand it, but they would still engage with it. That time is long gone. Like, that just doesn't work anymore. You can't just build a better mousetrap and expect people to find it. You have to figure out what your community is and how to engage with that community. I think the second biggest one, specifically in the industries in which I tend to work, which is software as a service, technical hardware kind of pursuits, consumer product kind of companies, the biggest misconception is that they're the right kind of company to go after venture capital or equity-based financing. And the close second there is that they seem to have the misunderstanding. Their assumption is that it's a venture capitalist job to write me a check, which is not at all the case. So people who are in that role are, and the most interesting thing about the industry is negotiations are happening by two very desperate people trying to move their business forward. So the entrepreneur has a product or a company, and they need capital to propel that company forward. The venture capitalist has taken money from a bunch of high net worth individuals or funds or foundations, and they need to return 10 times that money to the people they've literally borrowed it from in a certain period of time. So it's this very like desperate conversation between two parties. It's not a venture capitalist job to cut you a check. It's a venture capitalist job to make money for their LPs. And unless you can convince them how they're going to make money for those limited partners, you're never going to win at that conversation. And so that's a big misconception. And then I think the third one I see quite often is I started this company so I could work on something I was passionate about. And the reality of starting a company is that thing that motivated you to start the company and you're super passionate about, congratulations, you no longer get to work on that ever again. You have to focus on all the other stuff that has to do with running a business. You have to focus on the spreadsheets and the taxes and the employees and the motivation and imbuing your team with that same passion that you have, but you don't get to like lock yourself away and tinker with the product anymore. Like your job is running the business. And I think that's a really hard transition for folks. And so a lot of what we try and do at Pi is give them the opportunity to say, this isn't what I signed up for. Like I started this company because I thought I would get to focus on this thing, and now I don't get to do that anymore, and that's not fulfilling for me. And that's perfectly okay, but that's not being a founder. That's having a really interesting hobby with something that's super compelling. Like go do that, get a day job to make ends meet, but don't fool yourself into thinking you need to be a founder for a product to exist or have value for a community.
Oh, okay, this is a great one, especially from me to you. Okay, so I'm often riddled with doubt that I'm not as important as the other people vying for time, from people who need who are needed by so many people. So someone like yourself, but there's a ton of them out there, right? So what advice would you give to people who are trying to connect to experts, not just experts in the startup world, but if you need to ask questions, right? When are you supposed to be persistent and when do you need to let go of it? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And so I tried to be a founder. Part of the reason I'm so forgiving of founders was I started with all those misconceptions. And one of my companies, like, basically, if there was a book written about how to do everything wrong, we followed that book like page by page. And so I can distinctly remember being on, and this is back in the old days, I can distinctly remember being on an IM conversation with somebody, and it was just taking them forever to respond. And I was so used to like being on Skype or IM with friends and like it just being boom, 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 boom. And so I expected those conversations to be immediate. And it was such a moment for me where I recognized that this person was being bombarded with so many things that they were just trying to help, but they could only do so much at any given moment. And so the flip side of that is that I think there's a real tendency for folks to assume ill will or assume ego or something along those lines when folks, which is what I was doing, right? When folks are just like genuinely busy. They're not ignoring you. They're just overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
so it's not that they don't want to talk to you. It's not that they're not interested in what you're doing. In fact, I think I gain a great deal of satisfaction from hearing from people who are doing things and answering questions for people who are having problems or difficulties. That's super rewarding for me, but I just don't do a good job of managing that. So like my inbox is a mess. Like you can DM me and it's a mess. And there are certain windows of time where I'm super responsive and then I'll suddenly go dark. Like you experienced it in setting up this interview, right? I was like, oh yeah, we can totally have you on. And then like, who knows how long went by, 7 days. And then I come back, oh yeah, the interview, we should get that scheduled. But I think I'm not asking folks to have, it's not even empathy. It's just patience really is all it is. And don't, I can only speak from my perspective, but don't ever think you're being annoying to me. I hate to admit it, but you kind of have to, it's like in that, if you're in a hierarchical organization, it's kind of that concept of managing up. Like I'm not doing a good job of managing my time. So unfortunately, I'm putting that emotional labor on you, but I'm also not offended if you're bugging me about stuff. Like that's helpful to me. And like it or not, it's very much the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you try, and continue and, happen to hit one of those windows where I'm actually like in my inbox or in my DMs and paying attention and being responsive, then suddenly it happens. And I'm never frustrated by people who are consistent about like, hey, we need to meet up, or hey, we need to get this on the schedule. Like I recognize that I'm doing a bad job of managing my time, and I actually see that as a favor, you taking the time to help me figure that out.
Well, I know that we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm afraid if I ask you another question, we'll run over.
Okay, so let's pause, and maybe we'll do this again, and you can ask a bunch more questions. We'll do your full interview compliment at some point in time. This is the point in time, you've seen the show before, and if other people have, this is the point in time where we as a community come back to you, Leah, and say, what can we do to be helpful? How can we help you right now?
I feel like this is Hot Ones, and I'm supposed to be pointing at different cameras. You should watch the show. It's good. They do a good job. They throw endorphins at people by making them eat really spicy food and then ask them really intimate questions at the very end. And they're so overwhelmed with the spicy food that they give really honest answers. So I totally want to do it from now on. Just make people eat hot food when I interview them. Things that I need. I need developers.
Okay.
If you know devs who want to work on either an app about helping geeks who want to meet, which is totally my knitting a sweater just fun project. So if they just want to geek around and do that, or to work on something that's actually important, like a COVID-19 project, then send them our way. Okay. Because we'd be happy to have people helping. And then also, shoot because human, any startups who need help, or people who are running workshops or anything that they need. I will bend over backwards to help you. I just like doing it, and I like being busy. I get money now. I mean, like money's good, but like I feel like working for Karma, it pays off way more. So,
yep. Okay, yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, Leah, thank you so much for spending the time. Thank you for interviewing me. Makes my job easier on this side of the camera. And we'll definitely need to set up one of these again. So I really appreciate having you here. Thanks so much. For other folks and for Leah, you too, tomorrow we actually have 2 interviews going. It'll be our first 2-time experiment. So we've got Kate Ertman, who is like phenomenal in terms of operations for early stage startups, who's going to be tomorrow morning. So grab a cup of coffee. I think it's at like 10 a.m. around that time period, and join us for that and get your questions submitted for Kate. And then in the afternoon, we will have around this time, we'll have Leah Spencer from the Portland Business Journal, and she's been kind enough to spend some time with us just talking about like how you deal with journalists and media as a startup or as somebody who wants to get some time or some coverage from media folks. So I'm hoping you can join us for that. As always, it's great to have you here. Again, thank you, Leah. Really good to see you and really good to talk to you. Hang in there. We'll talk to everybody soon. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.